where they are.
Yeah. Always
Stuck in
happens.
traffic.
Well, that's true too, yeah.
Always happens.
So but we only have the hour, so.
Well, I'm just
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Institute's newly renovated headquarters building. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President here at MEI. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's talk with Congressman Mike Waltz on the key priorities of the United States in Afghanistan. With the recent suspension of the negotiations between the U.S. and the Taliban and the still pending results of the presidential election, there's clearly a lot to discuss. As you know, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi led a bipartisan delegation on a visit to Kabul over the weekend for briefings with senior Afghan leaders as well as with the U.S. Embassy, U.S. military commanders, and with Secretary of Defense Esper, also in Afghanistan at the same time. Congressman Waltz is particularly well positioned to discuss these and other issues of immediate concern regarding Afghanistan. Prior to his election to Congress in 2018, Congressman Waltz served multiple tours in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Africa. He is the first Green Beret ever elected to the United States Congress. Yes, good. Representative Waltz is also a former White House and Pentagon policy advisor. He currently serves on the House Armed Services Committee, the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection of Force, and the Intelligence, Emerging Threats, and Capabilities Committee. I look forward to hearing Congressman Waltz's insights from his experience on the ground as to what priorities the United States should pursue in Afghanistan and the surrounding region. Following his remarks, he will sit down with Marvin Weinbaum, Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute. Marvin is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and served as an analyst for Pakistan and Afghanistan in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research from 1999 to 2003. We will be using the interactive site menti.com to take questions today. If you pull out your phones or laptops and enter the information you see printed on your flyers, you will have the opportunity to enter your questions, which Marvin will be able to view during the talk. You'll also be able to view and upvote other audience member questions, which will appear on your screens once you log in. Marvin will refer to the most popular questions throughout the conversation. We will be live streaming the event today. Ask that you all silence your cell phones, but you can join the conversation using the hashtag MEI Afghanistan. With that, allow me to welcome Congressman Waltz to the podium.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. There's been 4 Navy SEALs elected to Congress and the Senate, and I'm the first Green Beret, so I just like to tell them it takes 4 of them to equal 1 of us, and go Army. Now, look, let me just elaborate a little bit more aside from the kind of the scripted bio on how I've experienced and how I've seen this conflict unfold, particularly since 9/11. I had a very going back to the military service, I had a very unique perspective in that both the SEALs and Green Berets have reserve units, which meant my day job, I had to have a day job, a civilian job, but in that capacity, I worked for Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and then Gates, and then went over in the Bush White House and eventually worked for Vice President Cheney as his South Asia and counterterrorism advisor. What was unique about it was that in between, I mobilized as reservists and deployed. So I had to be one of the only only people in Washington that actually had to go execute the strategy that I was recommending. You better make sure it's right, because it was my rear end on the line. But that perspective was also very fascinating. How is it that you're in the White House Situation Room proposing policy, you're there as the president says, this is the direction we want to go. I would then mobilize, get out on the ground, and we're doing almost everything but what the president back in Washington said to do. And then the really amazing part was coming back, demobilizing, take off the uniform, put the coat and tie back on, and go, hey, boss, respectfully, I know what you were just briefed. Let me tell you what's actually happening on the ground and provide that real ground truth. And that formed the basis of a book that I wrote called Warrior Diplomat, that really, although it is kind of my experience, it really takes a hard look at how we have those disconnects from policy to execution, but then also looking at the war from all of those different perspectives. On how our aid, so much aid has been misspent, on our difficulties with advising and training the Afghan National Security Forces, with being on the ground and dealing with the cross-border issues with Pakistan and Pakistan's support for the insurgency, but then being back in Washington and trying to couple that with our broader relationship with Pakistan. And so that has been, I think, in many ways, the kind of story of this engagement. We're 18 years in. But I want to talk to you in a moment where I think we really have to change that timeline and change that narrative. So let me just, that's the perspective that I bring. And there's all kinds of other things. I led the search for Bo Bergdahl, if you remember that young man. I took command the day he walked off his base and the effects that had on the campaign and the election in 2009. And I've been going there ever since on the private sector, which is much more liberating in many ways, because I can run around in a beat up old taxi and really engage with parliamentarians and ministers and others that you can't do when you're in government. So where are we? Let's just kind of dive right into where we are now. And then I know Marvin's going to ask all kinds of great questions. And then from my perspective now, having been in the Pentagon, having been in the White House, having been out on the ground in combat, and now sitting in Congress, and where we're going with all of this. So where we are now, I applaud the president from walking away from what I think was a bad deal. And for reasons that are still a little bit unclear to me of how and why that deal was formulating like it was. But the bottom line, the issues that I had and have said publicly repeatedly was, I think the deal could have been a propaganda victory for the Taliban. I think they were making promises about Al-Qaeda, that they were writing checks that they couldn't cash, to use old Southern saying. I'm a representative from North Florida. But basically, they were making promises to vis-a-vis the Al-Qaeda that they didn't have the military capability to execute. It was never clear to me how the Taliban were promising to prevent Afghanistan from being used as a safe haven for international terrorism, and how they were going to be able to do that as opposed to a 300,000-man Afghan army and an international coalition with all of its associated support, its Air Force, helicopters, and what have you. Of course, we know the government was excluded. The Afghan government was excluded, at least from the initial round. The timing of it happening just before the presidential elections. I feared that the Afghan army could become demoralized by the optics of the United States striking a deal with their enemies, and that could lead to a fracturing. It wasn't clear to me how the safe havens in Pakistan were included in the deal. And then finally, there was no ceasefire. So I could probably go on, but that was just the beginning of my list of issues with the deal as it stood. Let's take a step back for a moment. Really, what I think was driving a lot of that was the president and many Americans. I mean, I represent nearly 1 million Floridians. Many Americans' frustration with how long, how hard, how expensive, how difficult this effort has been for the United States, and the lack of clarity of where it's all going. What does success look like? How long are we going to be there? And that really, frankly, the absence of a really enunciated or a declared strategy going forward. So the frustration is very real. I could tell you it's very real outside of the Washington, D.C. bubble. And I think we've seen that manifest with everything from President Bush to President Obama to now President Trump. That doesn't mean, just because it's hard, though, it doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And it doesn't mean the situation can't get worse. But I think what we're seeing, particularly now that I'm over in Congress, there is a very real isolationist trend, and this is just one piece of that broader conversation of what does American leadership look like around the world? How engaged and where are we and where do we engage? We're seeing that play out with Syria right now. My point and my position has been America has to lead. We do not have a choice but to continue to stay engaged in Afghanistan and in Syria, because terrorism and the problem of extremism will follow us home. We saw that with President Obama when he pulled out of Iraq too soon, in my opinion, and that led to the creation of ISIS, and we saw that problem follow us into Europe in the biggest refugee crisis since World War II, flowing out of Syria, and then the resultant problem following us home. If you look at where Afghanistan and Pakistan stands today, half the world's terrorist organizations still exist in that border region. So we can have and should have a debate and conversations on how to do it better and how to engage in a way that is better. But in my view, these are but individual battlefields, so to speak, or engagement or conflicts in a much broader conflict with extremism. And what I would love to see us talking about is how do we undermine the ideology of extremism, much like we undermined the ideology of communism over several decades. We could probably have a whole other session, Marvin, on what that looks like. One piece, one element of that, of many, I think has to do with girls' education and women's empowerment. If you look at where women are empowered in business and civil society and politics, you don't have an overwhelming extremism problem. Not to oversimplify things, but I think that holds to be true in many, many countries around the world. So in my view, we need to get girls' education out of the kind of feel-good humanitarian realm and make it a national security issue, and get behind it in the way that we get behind other national security issues. I could go on, but what are those broader elements of our messaging and of our strategy to undermine extremism? Because it's only in that way that we're going to finally be able to extricate ourselves. Very quickly, what does it look like in the short term going forward? Well, right now, I think we need to help the Afghans get through their election process. We need a legitimately elected partner on the ground to be able to work with. And I worry that this current election will be contested like the one in 2014. I worry that the administration has a lot of things going on its plate, and that it will need to step in a way to help get us to a point where all of the actors and stakeholders in Kabul and around the country buy into the next government. And then I would love to see the Afghan plan. It has to be an Afghan plan for reconciliation and present to the administration and to the Congress a pathway to reduce America's footprint and to increase local security reliance moving forward. And finally, I'll say that's important. I don't think just pulling American troops home should be the goal of a strategy. If that's the goal, then we still have 50,000 in Japan. We have 30,000 in South Korea. Heck, we even have a battalion in the Egyptian Sinai, peacekeeping, counting ships going through the Suez Canal. So I've told the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, and others, look, if we want to pull a few hundred troops home, there's a lot less risky places to do it than Afghanistan or Syria or others where extremism is still such a threat. But I do think we have to work in a way to do this efficiently, because the existential problem of, at least I think my time in Congress from a national security standpoint, is how do we deal with extremism, China, Russia, rogue states in Iran, and North Korea overlaid with 23 trillion in debt and growing. And that is a huge, huge problem, of which this is an important subset. So I think with that, I'll stop and go over to you.
Let's activate our.
Thank you.
Activate the-
I think I'm activated. Yes?
You're activated.
Everybody hear me? Okay, great.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Congressman. Just very recently, we've witnessed President Trump order a precipitous withdrawal from Syria.
Sure.
It's come in for a great deal of criticism. Do you see that in what has happened in Syria having consequences for what will happen in Afghanistan? Does this suggest that we are now looking at the possibility of a similar announcement, a tweet, if you will, that we are leaving Afghanistan? We did hear today that 2,000 American forces will be withdrawn. That will bring it down to about 12,000, with the possibility out there of 8,500. But what we've seen in Syria was complete. Or may I suggest that you respond to, is it possible, given the response to what happened in Syria, that if that were likely to be planned, or at least considered, however spontaneously or not, if that were to be the case, that now the reaction makes that impossible for the president to now precipitously pull us out of Afghanistan?
Marvin, don't ask me to predict the president's tweets.
Okay. well taken.
Don't know. But I can look, I could just share with you the conversations I'm having with the administration, the Pentagon, and my colleagues who share kind of my same worldview, such as Senator Graham and Representative Liz Cheney and others on the Armed Services Committee. First of all, we've seen the dynamic where these issues tend to kind of explode on the national conscious with the president tweeting. But this issue with Turkey, the safe zone, and the Kurds has been boiling for some time. Erdogan has been stating he's going to be coming across. I've talked to the chairman, General Milley, Mark Espert, and others, and they've shown me and conveyed to me how they have repeatedly asked and told and cajoled Erdogan not to do this. And he finally said, I'm coming in the next 48 hours. My tanks will be rolling. And the president was faced with a very difficult decision. Now, I think we could debate whether leaving 28 Green Berets on that border was a wise decision or a foolish decision. I am encouraged at the end of the day, by the trip out to Ankara. Let's hope that ceasefire holds. And my position has been we have to keep a presence in Syria to keep the focus on ISIS, both the ones detained and the ones, the leadership that are still active. And we cannot let Russia and Assad completely fill that void. What does that portend for Afghanistan? Well, I spoke to the fact that the president is frustrated at how much we're spending and the lack of what he calls the endless wars. And as you heard me mention, that we're 18 years into this, and where is it all going? I believe that the conversation has to change. I use and engaging the White House and the Pentagon and others, and frankly, very active isolationists on the right, like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham and others. If you want to talk about an endless war, a war that we've been in a long time, let's look at the 50,000 troops that we've had in Japan since the end of World War II. Let's point to the fact that the South Korean army had a higher illiteracy rate than the Afghan in the 1950s than the Afghan army does today. It's not a perfect analogy, but what it is an example of is American engagement and leadership. And that country, South Korea in particular, has moved from a country that was occupied for 30 years, highly illiterate, no natural resources to speak of, no infrastructure, no military, and now is one of the largest economies in the world. Again, I know it's not a perfect analogy, but I don't think we have a choice but to stay engaged. The choice is, do we completely withdraw, let terrorism fester? I pray this wouldn't happen, but I would fear the Afghan government would fracture, the army along with it, and then we have to fight our way back in to deal with the issue with a local ally that we've abandoned. So from everyone that I'm talking to, the plan is to leave it at around 8,600. I think you're going to see two elements, a counterterrorism element and an advisory element. My caution has been to not draw down that advisory element too far, because that is the building up the Afghan National Security Forces. And heck, I wrote a whole book on how we could do it better. But building up the Afghan National Security Forces, much like we have security forces around the world, whether they're the Colombians or the South Koreans, is the long-term plan. My fear, if we pull back too far and too fast, is that I remind folks the South Korean army didn't fall when we pulled our advisors out. The South Korean army fell when Congress, a few years later, cut the funding. And I can foresee a situation where our advisors have been pulled back, we don't have oversight of American tax dollars, and the questions begin to grow about the billions of dollars that we are contributing to support the Afghan National Security Forces. So I think it's only responsible to leave both of those elements in
And those
place.
elements we're talking about are really there for stabilization.
That's right.
And stabilization, which may be in the interests of the local situation, but also in our interests.
I think it's absolutely in our
interests.
interest. I mean, again, half the world's terrorist organizations exist there. They fully intend to reconstitute. We know that from our reporting. And they fully intend to attack the United States again if given the opportunity. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of smart folks here who would talk about how that presence could be done differently or more effectively. But what I'm trying to prevent is us trying to walk away, the United States, like we did in 2014 in Iraq, and then that led to ISIS.
We've given the sense here that we're really there because of the fear of Islamic State emerging, and they're
And
perhaps-
Al-Qaeda,
and Al-Qaeda, and
a descent into chaos that would allow them.
and
to
the
emerge.
Taliban
Right.
giving them the kind of support that would enable them to mount these kinds of attacks.
Well, I would just add one more, Marvin, there and please feel free to tell me if you think I'm wrong, but I think if Afghanistan descends into chaos, there's a very real risk of it pulling Pakistan with it.
Well, you've just gone to my next.
So now we've got-
just gone to my next question.
So we have population of approximately 30 million and population of over 200 million with a nuclear arsenal. So again, from a pure just U.S. interest geopolitical standpoint, that to me is worth an investment of some U.S. forces and diplomatic engagement and economic engagement for stability in South Asia.
The great fear in the region is, yes, Taliban reasserting itself, dominating the country, but also a fear of chaos,
Right.
a fear of civil war. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying then is that it's not just about what Al-Qaeda and Islamic State and others may do, but there is a regional component to this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And we know from the documents pulled off of the Osama bin Laden raid in Abbottabad that Al-Qaeda fully plans to foment civil war in the wake of what it saw at that time was a full U.S. withdrawal under President Obama, to foment civil war, create chaos, move into the void, and reconstitute itself. And that, I think, will cost us, for those concerned about the current cost, this is the point that I keep making, that will cost us far more than a steady investment and a long-term investment on the front end.
Just occurs to me that this idea of a regional perspective here, a number of years ago, I wrote on this, and as it turned out, when they went into his library, my article was there in his library.
Something to be proud of, or I don't know.
I don't know. I wanted to ask you here about, you've spoken about the possibility here of some kind of reconciliation down the road, and you've specified it could happen if the Afghans, the intra-Afghan talks, produce some kind of a pathway forward, and that we would back that. But let's take this possibility, the very real possibility, that they can't get their act together any more than we've been able to find a policy with the Taliban which we could live with. What do we do then if we are faced with a situation where, at least for the foreseeable future, we don't see a political solution as possible? Would you still have us there?
You know, I mean, let's just look at this historically. No insurgency or no counterinsurgency or counterterrorism mission in history has been successful when the enemy enjoys unfettered sanctuary next door. So whether that is Vietnam and Cambodia, or we can go, we can go down the list. So I mean, right now the Taliban, from everything that I've digested, believes they are in a position of strength. They believe this deal was relatively good for them. That's not a deal then that I want to enter. How do we get to a position of strength is a great question, because when their leadership is relatively untouched in Quetta and in Miram Shah, then I think we have to figure out a way to put them at risk. And it will only be then that I think we can get them to the table in terms that I think are manageable and in our interest. The other piece is to take a hard look at more of a bottoms-up approach. In talking to many of the regional actors, it's not a monolith. It is more of a franchised model in both the Taliban and the Haqqani and other groups. And to the extent that we can enter very localized ceasefires and very localized deals rather than trying, kind of for a home run, I think is something worth exploring.
We've been talking about their...
I want to be clear there, though. Yeah. I mean, this conflict has to end in a political resolution. It's just the terms and the timing that, I think...
But can you foresee, with just this in mind, can you foresee not a grand bargain, but lots of little bargains?
Lots of baby bargains. Yeah.
Which leads not to reconciliation, but to something which we usually call reintegration.
Right. That's right.
What would
and that's
have
essentially,
to happen?
If you look at a parallel model, first of all, I think we have to manage, and that this takes leadership from Washington to manage people's expectations. Every year on 9/11, we pound the table. 10 years in, 12 years in, 18 years in, we were engaged. And how many Americans realize that we have had special operators working with the Colombians for the better part of 40 years, right? And look at how long it took to fractionalize and build bottoms up to a grand bargain with the FARC. That is still very tenuous. It's incredibly difficult to do, and it takes a long time. There are ways to do it better than others, but eventually we have to drive towards that.
Is this contingent on the Afghans themselves? That is, can we foresee that there is going to be any kind of political deal, whether it's one grand bargain or small, without the Afghans themselves, if you will, putting their act together? As long as they remain disunited, can we really anticipate that there is any way forward here towards a political settlement?
I think we can. We need to get through this election. Heck, our own elections are difficult. I'm not being critical of their process, but I can't imagine doing it trying to do it in the middle of an ongoing conflict. So I think we need to help them through this electoral process in a way that everybody is, I don't even want to say comfortable with, at least less uncomfortable with. to just manage that expectation. Let's get through that in the next few months. That is important. I know there's been a lot of articles written about the low turnout, 26% in this last round. I would take that any day rather than a smoke-filled room of people cobbling together some type of interim government. That's just my own bias. I think the democracy is imperfect. It's difficult. Winston Churchill used to say American democracy is the worst system of government in the world, except all the others. It's taken us a long time to get to where we are. I think it's important that Kabul and the region here, Washington, fully support that process, as imperfect as it may be. At that point, then, let's re-engage in this process. And I think we can do it locally, bottoms up, and then build up. And at the same time, there has to be pressure on Quetta. There has to be pressure on Miram Shah. There has to be a reason that they want to come to the table. And we can spend time on the carrots and sticks approach, but that's at least roughly how I see things unfolding in the next year.
Okay, thank you. Let's take one of the questions that we've had sent to us. What specific challenges did you encounter on the ground in implementing Afghanistan policy?
Part of it, there were many, but one of the toughest, I think, was the lack of continuity of our policy and the lack of continuity of our expertise. What do I mean by that? Well, we talk a lot, we've been there 18 years, but we do not have there wasn't a cumulative effect because we were rotating people, diplomats, commanders. I think there's been, 16 ISAF commanders in 18 years. I don't even know how many ambassadors. And then, down at the local level, there was a real lack of continuity, and that was, frankly, borderline criminal because it got people killed. In my own experience, I took command of the special operations along the border region in 2009. As I tried to look at my data, who we had talked to, what tribes we had engaged, where we had projects, I could only go back about 9 months. We'd been there 8 years, right? The local provincial reconstruction team couldn't point out to its new commander or me where it had invested American dollars over the previous 8 years in a cumulative fashion. So really, we've had 18 one-year wars rather than one 18-year war. We have gotten better over time, but there was no single repository for me or anyone else to go to. And I mean, we did a good job of describing when we had violent incidences. We did a terrible job of describing why. And what were those drivers of instability, and really how we got to the bottom of them and how they had built up or developed over time. My biggest kind of source of corporate knowledge were my interpreters, and how embarrassing it would be to go into a valley that we hadn't been in 2 or 3 years and to encounter an elder to say, nice to see you again after 3 years. I gave kind of my list of needs to your predecessor's predecessor, and it was just incredibly frustrating. So I write about that, but I also write about the nature. I think there's a couple of drivers. One, we never mobilized as a country, I think, to deal with the scale of this effort, number one. Number two, this isn't an indictment on the Iraq War, but no country can fight 2 wars as well as it fights one. So I saw the resources being shifted. I think before we were at a really stable place in Afghanistan. We already touched on the problem with sanctuary in Pakistan. We could probably spend a whole other session on that. So I think it was really a witch's brew of events that we felt on the ground, but then also back from a policy perspective back here.
Is it possible, though, that...
And then one other piece,
sure,
we could go
sure,
on, I'm sorry.
Surely.
And then one other piece, the bond agreement was fantastic in many ways, but it did create a very centralized top-down structure. And I remember the briefings kind of floating around the Pentagon at the time that was called the counter-warlord strategy, right? And how do we, that was alongside the DDR process, the disarmament, demobilize, and reintegration. So there were a lot of well-intended I think strategies at the time that were probably didn't set us off in the best direction.
Okay.
There's a lot of successes too. I don't want to paint too negative of a picture, but you asked the challenges. Those were the challenges.
You know, it's sobering factor here is you mentioned the multiple wars.
Yeah.
If we go back to 1978, we can count 6 separate civil wars that have occurred consecutively in the country.
Yeah.
We like to think that this one we can get a better handle on. The one element that went through all of these is there was an Islamic insurgency. And I think that we have to recognize that. And the question, of course, is how can we integrate what the Taliban stand for in some ways? And is that compatible with a constitutional democratic government? Have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you know, one of the initiatives that I pushed for in the White House and then actually was mobilized and was able to implement was the Village Stability Operations Program, which took our, the difference with Green Berets than SEALs or Rangers or others. We specialize in local cultures. We learn the language. We embed in their societies to understand them as well as we can and then enable them. And we put special forces teams out in the villages with tribes that wanted to work with the government, wanted to work with us, and wanted to work against the insurgency. And it was within 6 months, we saw these units go from completely armored in a very kind of defensive posture to literally, riding around in pickup trucks and T-shirts and flip-flops because we enabled the local Arbakai and the local tribal structure. We bolstered it, we defended it when it came under attack, and we saw them provide their own security through their own dispute resolution with a little support and frankly with us in between them and some of the bad actors that were in the Afghan government as well, some of the more corrupt and difficult actors. But we had to be on the ground, we had to understand, and we had to have that continuity of knowledge. I think that's that's our challenge when trying to do this kind of engagement, when we're walled into bases and we have that kind of literally walls between us and the populace that we're trying to defend. It makes it incredibly difficult. The Taliban obviously are out there. Even foreign fighters are out there. We have to be out there with them. Unfortunately, the program was pulled during the Obama drawdown, just as we were really starting to see fantastic pockets of success around the country.
You put a lot of emphasis on Pakistan and the obstacle that Pakistan poses by still providing sanctuary, particularly for the leadership.
Right.
Has the war, though, evolved in the sense that whereas perhaps 10 years ago, if they had cut off the Taliban, they could have really destroyed them at that point. But at this point in time, that the Taliban have so ensconced themselves now in Afghanistan and that they can live off the proceeds of smuggling and poppy growing and extortion of various kinds, so that it's a much more complicated situation.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. As time has gone on, it will make it more difficult, but I don't see how this resolves itself in a way that is aligned with U.S. interests. And in order to do that, the break would need to happen with a capability to enforce it with some of these international terrorist groups that fully intend to attack the West. I fully believe that we are in a multi-generational effort. I know that's not popular to say or popular to hear, but I think we're going to be engaged for quite some time. We need to continue to work with the Pakistanis so that we have a partner on both sides of the border. But again, those are almost, they're strategic, but they're quasi-tactical efforts in the broader effort of undermining extremism. We had terrorist organizations that recruited in the name of communism. The Shining Path in Peru, the Red Brigades. Why can't they recruit anymore? Because the ideology is defunct and has lost credibility. That's the broader issue of where we need to get, and we need partners in both the Afghan and the Pakistani government. And they have to make a concerted decision that this is in their national interest to go after in a meaningful way.
Great. Let's take another question from
Sure.
the audience. Given the silent troop withdrawal that has been happening over the past few months, what does congressional appetite look like for continuing to support Afghanistan and help move the country forward out of war?
It is mixed. I'll be candid. There are many who are saying, are asking the same questions of how long, how difficult, how much money. There is a lot of concern about the military buildup in China. There's concern about a very still dangerous Russia, the rogue states that we've already talked about, that can be a threat to the United States. And unfortunately, or fortunately, when we have a period of, a relatively period of peace from terrorism attacks or inspired attacks, those questions tend to grow. When we have attacks like the Pulse nightclub near my district in Florida, we have attacks like San Bernardino, that's very much on people's consciousness. But there's a cause and effect, though. Yeah. My position is we have to stay on offense. We have to engage abroad. We cannot stick our heads in the sand and take an isolationist posture. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Thank you. Another one of these good questions, I think.
Yeah.
Will the U.S. play a role in mediating the upcoming results of the Afghan elections if there is a dispute between the candidates and their campaign parties, like happened in 2014?
I hope so, and I will certainly be encouraging the administration to do so.
Okay.
I think it's the Afghans that I talk to are expecting us to do so. I think many assume that we are doing so, regardless of whether we are or not. But I understand the position of, hey, we don't get involved in other people's elections. But I think taking a completely hands-off approach here can lead to a fracturing and a simmering of ethnic tension that's just below the surface. So I would personally ask for a fair and balanced engagement approach on the U.S.'s perspective.
Of course, what we did last time was to avoid possible conflict between the various factions, among the various factions, and we came up with a formula that didn't work very well.
Right.
Do we have...
I've told my constituents it was kind of like putting, Hillary Clinton and President Trump in the same administration and saying, work it out. That's basically what we did in 2014.
Yeah.
It's tough.
Although those
I don't know if that analogy is going to get me in trouble.
Those two did share basic commitment to democratic process.
Right.
But that would require that we would have an alternative formula, and also require very importantly that we have the diplomatic skill to be able to get both sides to agree to something. As I recall, Secretary of State Kerry ultimately succeeded because he threatened, if you guys can't get together, then we're going to pull all of our economic support out of this country. That certainly focused their minds.
Yeah. Marvin, I'm not close enough to the situation to know if this is a carrots or a sticks kind of approach, and what President Ghani and Abdullah and other actors are going to be most responsive to. But at the end of the day, I would just call on everyone to look to the future of Afghanistan. I do believe the United States' future and its security and its prosperity is intertwined with Afghanistan's prosperity. It is worth reminding folks, it was the heart of where the 9/11 attacks came from. I know they were not Afghans, they were primarily Saudis, but at least where Al-Qaeda built its base. We cannot allow a return to that. We cannot allow a descent into chaos. And I hope, and I'm certainly confident, that the political leaders of Afghanistan will keep the best interests of its country in mind.
And I think
we, need to take an engaged posture
Okay.
to help us get to an arrangement that works for everyone.
But do we have, as I say, the diplomatic skills to be able, do we have the seasoned diplomats to be able to step in and prevent what we would agree?
I think
with
so.
okay.
I think so. I'm confident in our diplomatic corps. I'm confident in our foreign service officers, and I'm confident in our military leadership that's overall.
Okay. It's ultimately going to be our political will, though, I think,
Sure.
of course. Yeah.
That's right.
Let's
Well, I'm
take
sitting here
yeah.
as a politician,
Yeah,
so
well-
trying to show whatever bit of will I can.
Great. What sort of bipartisan cooperation is there in Congress?
So I could let me just tell you
Yeah.
that this issue of American engagement around the world, or what many people are calling is more of a focus on America first. That's both of those are bipartisan. The engagement tends to come from veterans. I have formed a caucus called For Country that's Republican and Democrat. It is made up of national security professionals and veterans who have served all over the world, and we know that what we do around the world isn't always perfect, but that there is, America must lead, and when we don't, bad things fill the void. I do not want to share a worldview with Russia, with China, or other countries that do not share our values. And I think America has to lead. Our partners need to share the burden, absolutely. But it's not a zero sum. It's not a 500,000-man American army invasion or nothing. There's a lot of in between. And I tend to find, frankly, those that are saying, well, we just have to get out, whether it is South Korea or Syria or Afghanistan, we're spending too much. I think take for granted the world order that we have secured since World War II, and tend to have not served abroad to understand really the necessity of American leadership.
And of course, what we have seen is voices in both parties
That's right.
are pursuing exactly this kind of strategy.
And this isn't new, right? If you look at, just read what FDR went through to get the United States engaged over a lot of opposing voices to get them engaged in World War II. And I fear we tend to wait until sometimes it's a little too late or catastrophic on our shores. In that case, it was Pearl Harbor. In 9/11, it was, in the 2000s, it was 9/11.
And we still held out in Europe until Germany declared war on us.
That's right.
We didn't declare war on Germany.
That's right. So this isolationist trend has run long and deep since our founding fathers.
Yes.
Beware of engagements in European wars, right? But I think at the end of the day, our values and our leadership must be front and center.
So with that, we have global responsibility.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Would you support a new round of U.S. Taliban negotiations, or should we go back to the earlier position that the talks must be between the Taliban and the Afghan government?
So I do think that the Afghan government has to be at the table first and foremost. I would support returning, but when the conditions are right. And I would again encourage State Department. I have encouraged the State Department and our military leaders to look at more localized solutions. I think the ceasefire that happened in the north was very encouraging from everyone that I talked to. This was 2017. The ceasefire that happened, I believe it was in Kunduz, if I remember correctly.
Well, it was across the country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, right, but I
Yeah.
think it emanated there.
Yeah.
So that's a model that I would take a hard look at.
Okay. Is there an interest to gear U.S. policy towards Afghanistan to tackle civilian casualties, airstrikes on community villages, and internal corruption?
So we have seen that. I think that focus go in ebb and flow. We remember HR ebbs and flows. We remember HR McMaster's Shafafiyat task force that was very focused on internal corruption. I can tell you as a special operator and as an officer still serving in the National Guard, we are incredibly focused on preventing civilian casualties. There's, I think, a notion out there that just, predators are striking from the sky and it's kind of willy-nilly, and that is absolutely not the case. If I were to count up the number of engagements, we have walked away from more engagements because of the fear of civilian casualties than we've ever actually pulled the trigger on. There is a lot of thought towards it. There's a lot of consideration. But you have to also weigh, I've talked to a lot of my colleagues over on the Iraq-Syria side. It's a difficult decision. Sometimes there may be 2 or 3 or 4 civilians that we see are helping, whether it's ISIS or the Taliban or others, and we know that if we walk away from that engagement, they will kill far more civilians in their campaign of terror. Those are difficult decisions to make, but I want to assure everyone there is a lot of thought and consideration, and some of the most difficult decisions I've made are the shots I haven't taken that I then saw Afghans that were working with us killed later by those same groups, Afghan civilians. So it's not that easy.
How do you plan to use soft power of the State Department and USAID, and what programs would you want them to focus foreign aid on?
Well, I mentioned one, which was really having a very strong focus on girls' education and women, for a variety of reasons, but just the ones that I spelled out. You cannot. It really pulls the rug out from under the mantra of the extremists, and it's something that I'm most proud of when we look back on our engagement in Afghanistan. But I think there's other things. Really working on helping Afghanistan unlock its private sector potential. There was a lot of criticism of some of the business stability and the business task force. There was one in DOD, there was one in Commerce Department. They weren't always perfect, but I think they got a lot of great things done. I led some efforts when I was in the private sector to connect Afghan agribusiness, carpets, jewelry making, mining, and others with Indian and Middle Eastern suppliers and vendors. At the end of the day, I think we have to unleash Afghanistan's private sector, and that comes with some modicum of security. The telecommunications sector has done incredibly well. Some aspects of the mining sector has done incredibly well. How do we help foreign investment and foreign export is something that I'd really like to see us focus on.
Fine.
And those public-private partnership models are really, I think, the way to go.
Yeah.
Again, difficult, not perfect. I'm sure a lot of people will poke holes in those models, but...
Would you also include in that agriculture?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Rumors of restarting peace talks, there are rumors. What steps will the U.S. take to make sure that the Taliban are forced to give in to demands and to ensure that the government, women, and civil society are properly included?
So, in talking to the military commanders out there now, they have really stepped up their operations against Taliban infrastructure, ISIS infrastructure, Haqqani, Al-Qaeda, and others. In a way, I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of focus on the numbers of troops. I don't think that's really the message. The average Afghan that I talk to doesn't know or care whether we have 8,600, 5,600, 15,000. What they need to hear is that the United States is with you. That's what the business community needs to hear as well. That we are not on our way out, that we will stand with you, that stability in Afghanistan is in our national interest, and that we are going to be engaged on a truly conditions-based strategy, which the president announced roughly 18 months ago. I think the message is far more important than the numbers of troops, both for the private sector and, frankly, for the insurgency, the region, and the government. And that's what I hope to see going forward, and at least that's my message is loud and
so you're also
coming
saying
from Congress.
That there is a strong psychological dimension to this.
There's a huge psychological dimension. I was in my headquarters in 2009 when very excited to watch President Obama's speech at West Point where he announced the surge.
I remember.
but in the same speech announced its withdrawal and put it on a timeline. And one of my officers, who used a World War II analogy again, standing next to me, said, "Sir, can you imagine Franklin Delano Roosevelt announcing D-Day but telling the Germans we were only going to be there for 6 months, and what would have happened?" So we saw immediately, corruption spike, we saw an outflow of cash, we saw an outflow of human capital, and we saw everyone posturing and beginning for the beginning of the end. And it was very disappointing for me because I had been working with a Bengal elder whose Arbakai, whose militia, who by the way was heavily armed, protecting pine nuts of all things in eastern Afghanistan, their cash crop. They were on the fence, and they had committed to come work with us and to work with the Afghan government. He withdrew his support in the aftermath of that speech because he said, "Look, the Haqqani will have a gun to my family's head tomorrow, and now your president has told the world you're leaving." That was 2009. And we've gone in fits and starts ever since, rather than having that long-term message and saying we're committed, as we have all over the world in many places, because it's in our national security interest. That doesn't mean, again, I have this debate on the floor of the House of Representatives, 1 million American troops. It means a small footprint that can help bolster, advise, train, and assist the Afghan security forces to eventually be able to take care of their security on their own.
The president has said, both going back to the campaign and ever since, that he wants to pull out of Afghanistan. Is that not another version of what Obama did by saying that we're only here for a short period, and at the same time also talk about conditions where you can't have both of those?
Yeah,
Indeed, the agreement, which the aborted agreement, talked about staying only additional 14 months.
I don't like timelines. All I can do is weigh in from my foxhole. I don't like timelines. I think they're counterproductive, both for the enemy and our friends. I'm encouraging the White House and the Pentagon to stick with that conditions-based strategy. I think that's in our interest and the region's interest. But I don't think it's quite the same. I mean, when you put a date certain that I will be out, which is what the previous administration did, that was incredibly unhelpful to those of us that were out on the ground at the time, and I think for the broader strategy.
Ambassador Khalilzad is on his way to Brussels, France, and Russia, presumably to seek ways to restart peace talks. We were on the verge of signing a bad deal. What measure can Congress take to prevent another bad deal?
Well, one of the things that I have co-sponsored, one of the pieces of legislation, was having the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense certify to the Congress that certain conditions are in place before we can go utilize funds. I mean, that's our system. That's the lever that we have before they can utilize funds to fully withdraw. So I'm on record and on board with that from a congressional perspective. Look, I do think from Ambassador Khalilzad's perspective, we do need regional buy-in. This does need we do need regional support for the long term. But those conditions that I laid out have to be in a better place. And I saw zero indication from the Taliban leadership that they were serious about peace. There was no agreement for a ceasefire. There was no public denunciation of international terrorism. They were literally killing Afghans and Americans in the run-up to the signing of this deal. So I think we need to see a very different indication before we enter into serious talks again.
I know there are people in the audience who, maybe we can take one question from the audience. Jerry?
Thank you very
Hi,
much.
Jerry.
Now you're going to have to stand up, introduce yourself, and speak as loudly as you can.
Jerry Hyman, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C.
Great, Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's particularly good to have a person who has been in the field, in the Army, in the Special Forces, etc., and not just here in Washington. Gives a real reality check to this. I guess the question, Congressman, is not so much how long are we going to be there and what are the resources, but what is the strategy going forward?
Mm-hmm.
Recognizing that there have been ups and downs, in and out, various different waivers, the quote strategy has been basically the same for the last 18 years. We're going to support the ANDSF. We're going to build them up.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to try to make sure that the government is less corrupt than it was,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But we now find ourselves with the Taliban in more control, in control of more territory than it was in 2001 when we entered. What's the plan? Never forget whether we stay or don't stay.
Sure.
There needs to be a plan.
Sure.
Eisenhower had a plan. So did MacArthur.
Right. I got you. So I would ask again, back to my analogy, if we went and talked to Eisenhower in 1959 and said, what is your plan for South Korea, which I remind folks was a dictatorship until the 1980s, we had a strategy of bolstering and building and supporting the South Korean army. We had a strategy of U.S. engagement to prevent and deter the North Korean army. I think that is an acceptable, I think we could dig into ways to do that better, but I do think it is an acceptable strategy to bolster the Afghan National Security Forces, again, ways we could do it better, but ensure we have a presence, a unilateral counterterrorism presence that keeps al-Qaeda and the leadership on its back foot. There is a reason that Ayman al-Zawahiri can't and won't publicly rally al-Qaeda back to prominence, because he knows if he does so, he'll die, just to be candid. So I don't think that's an unreasonable strategy. I think there's a lot of ways we could do it better, and a lot of it gets into the soft power in how we can better engage in public-private partnerships and regional partnerships to help the Afghan economy really get to a better place. But as you know, they're interlinked. For economic prosperity, there has to be some modicum of security, and it has to be outside of Kabul. I think part of it is a big part of it. I don't think we can underestimate how poor our messaging has been over the last 10 years. When we are constantly on the brink of leaving, it is very difficult for any of those efforts to really bear fruit. And I think, again, not to overuse the analogy, I think South Korea would have been in the same place if every year we were telling the South Korean government and a very nascent South Korean army, who, by the way, to this day, if their war breaks out on the peninsula, they will fall under U.S. control 70 years later. So I think we have to manage our expectations, but also be very realistic of how we've frankly undercut ourselves in many ways over the last 18 years with 18 one-year wars. I could go on, and I'm happy to talk to you about what I think the strategy should be, but I think that will take, first and foremost, I'm very worried about the current political situation in Kabul. And I think if we don't get through that in a meaningful, reasonable way in the next 60 to 90 days, I'm concerned. I'm really concerned.
Congressman, we've run over our time.
Sure.
And I know that
thank you all for staying engaged.
Yeah.
And Washington loves to chase the latest shiny object, and this is this is absolutely critical to our national security and critical to our children's security.
I want to thank you on the behalf of Middle East Institute for coming over here and sharing us with your knowledge of the field of Afghanistan and your understanding of the issues.
Yeah.
I think this is really impressive, particularly because it's quite apparent that you've given this enormous thought and have seen this in a systemic way. And too often we find that people focus on single issues.
Yeah.
So we greatly appreciate
Thank you.
your joining us today, and let's express our appreciation.
Marvin, thank you for your leadership over the years on this. You've been at this for a while now.
50 years.
Yeah, a couple of years.
50 years.
I wasn't gonna say that. Thank you for your leadership and everything that the Middle East Institute does.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sure.